The corridors of the alien prison ship were cold and silent, the air heavy with the smell of metal and fear. Rian, a human soldier, moved quietly through the shadows, his boots making only the faintest sound against the steel floor. He had been sent here on a rescue mission, but what he found was far more than he expected. Behind the bars of a small, dimly lit cell, a young alien girl sat curled in the corner, her thin arms wrapped around her knees, her wide eyes fixed on him. She looked like a fragile creature, skin pale under the flickering light. Her clothes were torn, and there was dust in her tangled hair. The moment she saw him, she froze completely. Rian stopped. Holding his hands out in a slow, calm gesture, he spoke softly, his voice low and careful. "I'm not here to hurt you," but the girl only pressed herself further against the wall. Trembling, he could see it in her eyes, the deep fear. The stories she must have heard about humans. He took a step closer, and she flinched. Her small hands tightened into fists, ready to defend herself, even though she had no weapon. Rian understood. He had heard what alien cultures whispered about humans: dangerous, ruthless, merciless warriors. It wasn't true. Not for all humans. But how could she know that? Somewhere far down the corridor, an alarm began to blare. Red lights flashed overhead, and the metal walls seemed to shake with the distant sound of running feet. Enemy guards were coming. They would be here soon. Rian looked at the girl again. If she stayed here, she wouldn't survive. "I have to get you out of here," he said firmly, moving toward the control panel by the cell door. The girl's breath quickened. She thought he was coming in to harm her. But Rian only pressed a series of buttons until the cell lock clicked open. The door slid aside with a hiss. For a moment, neither of them moved. Rian extended his hand toward her. "Come on," he urged, but she stayed frozen. Her eyes darted to the open door, then back to him. Suspicion burned in her gaze. She didn't trust him, not yet. Footsteps grew louder, echoing in the narrow hall. Rian knew there was no more time. He stepped inside, careful not to make sudden moves. She tried to back away, but the wall stopped her. Her breathing was fast and shallow. Rian bent down so his eyes were level with hers. "I'm taking you out of here," he said. "Whether you trust me or not, I can't leave you here." "When?" She still didn't move. Rian made the choice for her. He lifted her gently into his arms. She gasped, struggling for a moment, but he held her steady. His grip was strong, but not painful, the moment they left the cell. The sound of boots pounding the floor drew closer. The corridor ahead twisted sharply. Rian ran, keeping her close against his chest. She was shaking so hard he could feel it through his armor. Blaster fire cracked in the distance, and the smell of burning metal filled the air. Twice, he had to duck into side passages to avoid patrols. His mind raced with the layout of the ship. He needed to reach the escape pods. She kept glancing up at him with a mix of fear and confusion. Why was he protecting her, when her people had always said humans only cared for themselves? Rian didn't have time to explain. Every second they spent here was another chance for the guards to corner them. They reached a set of blast doors, partially open from earlier damage. Rian slipped through, shielding the girl with his body so she wouldn't scrape against the jagged metal edges. Beyond was a long hall filled with smoke from a recent explosion. Sparks rained down from broken ceiling wires, and the floor vibrated under the ship's unstable systems. Halfway down the hall, they heard shouting behind them. The guards had found their trail. Rian quickened his pace, feeling the girl's tiny hands clutch his armor now, pushing him away. But holding on, it was a small change, but he noticed it at the end of the hallway. The door to the escape pods came into view. Relief surged through him, but before they could reach it, another explosion shook the ship. The ceiling cracked, and debris crashed to the floor, blocking the direct path. Rian cursed under his breath. The normal route was gone. He turned sharply, heading down an unmarked maintenance tunnel. It was dark and narrow, forcing him to duck his head as he ran. The girl buried her face against his chest. Try not to look at the falling sparks and flickering shadows. Somewhere deep inside, her terror was beginning to mix with something else, a small, fragile hope. She didn't know why she felt it. Maybe it was the way his arms never loosened, or the way his body always stayed between her and danger. But in that moment, even if she couldn't admit it, she started to believe he might not be the monster she had been told about. The tunnel opened into a storage room, where a secondary escape hatch waited. Rian sealed the door behind them, cutting off the sound of pursuit, for now. They had a moment to breathe. He set her down gently, looking into her eyes. "We're getting out of here," he said quietly. She didn't answer. But for the first time, she didn't shrink away from him. The storage room was dim and smelled of burnt wiring. Rian kept one hand on the alien girl's shoulder to guide her. She still hesitated at his touch, but she no longer flinched, like before. Outside, the muffled sounds of shouting and heavy boots echoed through the metal walls. The enemy was still searching, and it was only a matter of time before they found the hatch. Rian moved to the control panel beside the escape hatch. His fingers flew over the buttons, but a red warning light blinked at him. The hatch was locked down by the ship's emergency protocol. That meant one thing: he had to override it manually from the maintenance control room. And that was 3 decks above them. He turned back to the girl. "We have to move. It's not safe here." She looked at him with those cautious eyes, her lips pressing into a thin line. He could tell she wanted to argue or refuse, but something held her back. Maybe it was the chaos outside. Maybe it was the way he had carried her through danger without letting her fall. They slipped into the maintenance tunnels again. This time, Rian let her walk beside him, keeping a steady pace so she could keep up. Smoke curled through the air, stinging their eyes. The metal floor vibrated with every distant explosion. Somewhere far away, the deep hum of the ship's engines faltered. That was bad. It meant the battle outside was getting worse. They climbed up a narrow ladder, the metal rungs cold under their hands. The girl's breathing was uneven, but she didn't stop when they reached the 3rd deck. The hallway stretched before them, lit by a faint red glow. The air was thick with heat, and sparks fell from torn cables above, halfway down the hall. A group of enemy guards appeared from the corner. Rian's instincts kicked in instantly. He grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her into the nearest side passage. Blaster bolts sliced through the air, scorching the wall where they had just been. The noise was deafening. They ran, weaving through twisting corridors. Rian fired his own weapon to slow their pursuers. The girl stayed close, her small fingers gripping his hand like her life depended on it, because it did. Every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the heart of the ship, and every step took them closer to the maintenance control room. Finally, they reached it. The door was half open. Jammed by damage from the earlier blasts, Rian shoved it wider and pulled her inside. The control room was a mess, panels sparking, screens cracked, smoke curling up from burnt circuits, but the central override console was still intact, close. "The door," Rian told her. She hesitated, then pushed it shut. Her movements were awkward, but determined. He started working on the override, his fingers moving fast. Outside, the sound of running feet grew louder. He could hear them shouting orders, searching the nearby rooms. Then, without warning, an explosion rocked the ship. The walls trembled, and a section of the ceiling collapsed behind them. The girl let out a sharp cry. Rian grabbed her, shielding her from falling debris. Dust filled the air, and the floor tilted slightly under their feet. The ship was losing stability. He finished the override just as the first guard reached the doorway. Rian spun, firing a quick burst that forced the enemy to dive for cover. "Go," he shouted to the girl. She didn't need to be told twice. She darted out into the hall, and Rian followed, covering their escape. The heat in the corridors was unbearable now. Flames licked along the walls from ruptured fuel lines, smoke thickened. The air until it was hard to see. The escape hatch was 2 decks down, but every direct route was blocked by fire or collapsed beams. They had to take the long way around. They passed through a cargo bay where burning crates toppled over. The girl tripped, and Rian caught her before she fell. Lifting her again, he pressed forward. Weaving through falling debris, she clung to him, her face buried against his chest every few steps. The ship groaned like a wounded beast. Finally, the escape hatch came into sight at the end of a narrow corridor, but between them and freedom, a wall of fire roared from a broken fuel line. The heat was intense, and the metal underfoot glowed faintly red. The girl's eyes widened in terror. Rian scanned the walls, spotting a maintenance pipe above the flames. It wasn't built for walking, but it could carry their weight for a short distance. He slung his weapon over his back, adjusted his grip on her, and jumped. Catching the pipe with one arm, slowly, carefully, he inched along. The fire roaring below them. When they reached the other side, he dropped down. The hatch was right there. He keyed in the override code, and the door slid open with a hiss. Inside was a small, round chamber with 2 seats and a control panel, the escape pod. He set the girl down, her legs shaking as she stepped inside for the first time. She looked up at him with something that wasn't pure fear. It wasn't trust yet, but it was. Close, he strapped her into one seat and took the other. His fingers moved quickly over the controls as the pod detached from the ship. The roar of fire and the sound of battle faded into the background. Ahead of them, the stars stretched wide and endless. The girl sat in silence, still breathing hard. She glanced at him again, her eyes softer now. Rian didn't say anything. He just gave her a small nod, letting the silence speak for him. Somewhere deep inside, she began to wonder if everything she had been told about humans might be wrong. The escape pod drifted through the cold darkness of space, its small engines carrying it toward the nearest safe zone. Rian kept his eyes on the navigation screen, but his thoughts were still on the girl sitting beside him. She was quiet now, no longer shaking as badly, but she still watched him with that guarded look. They passed through the thin atmosphere of a small forest-covered moon. The pod rattled slightly during entry, flames licking at the windows before fading into the cool blue sky. Below, endless green stretched out in all directions, broken only by a silver river winding through the trees. Rian guided the pod toward a clear area, setting it down with a soft thud on a bed of grass. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world outside was calm, birds calling in the distance. Wind brushing through leaves, it felt far away from the chaos of the burning prison ship. Rian turned to her. "We're safe here for now," he said. His voice was steady, but he kept it gentle. She didn't reply, just looked away toward the window. Stepping out first, Rian scanned the area for threats. The air was fresh and cool, carrying the smell of wet earth. The trees swayed gently, their leaves glowing gold in the afternoon sun. He motioned for her to follow. After a short hesitation, she stepped out, her bare feet sinking into the soft grass. She glanced around like she wasn't sure if this was real. Rian began unloading supplies from the pod: blankets, water packs, a few ration bars, and some tools. He set them on the ground and started working on a small shelter using pieces from the pod's hull. The girl stayed a few steps away, watching him closely. Every time he looked at her, she turned her eyes toward the trees, pretending she wasn't staring. When he handed her a ration bar, she stared at it suspiciously. "It's food," Rian said, breaking a piece off to show her it was safe. She shook her head and pushed it back. He didn't force her. Instead, he left the bar near her and went to check the nearby river. He returned with a handful of small silver fish, cleaned and ready to cook. When he set them over the fire, the smell drifted through the air. She sniffed the air without meaning to. Her stomach made a soft sound, but she still didn't move closer. Rian pretended not to notice. When the fish was ready, he placed one on a flat stone a short distance from where she sat. Then he moved away to eat his own. Minutes passed before she finally reached for it. She took a small bite, then another. Soon the fish was gone. She didn't thank him. But she also didn't push him away when he offered water. It was a small step, but a step forward. That night, Rian kept the fire going until the moon rose. The air grew colder, and the sounds of insects filled the forest. The girl sat on the opposite side of the fire, her knees drawn to her chest. Her eyes kept flicking to him, as if trying to read his thoughts. He lay back on the grass, looking up at the stars, letting her see that he wasn't going to force her into anything. Sometime in the middle of the night, a sound echoed from the trees below. Distant growl. Rian sat up instantly. Scanning the darkness, the girl stiffened, eyes wide. He moved to the fire, grabbing his weapon. "Stay here," he said firmly, stepping toward the sound. She stayed frozen, her eyes following him. A shadow moved in the darkness. A pair of glowing eyes watching them from between the trees. Rian aimed his weapon, but the creature backed away slowly, vanishing into the forest. He waited a moment longer before returning to the fire. She was still staring at him, her hands gripping her knees tightly. "You're safe," he told her, settling back into his spot. The words were simple, but they seemed to calm her. She didn't reply, but she relaxed slightly. Her gaze stayed on him a little longer this time before she finally looked away. By morning, the forest was alive with birdsong. Rian checked their surroundings, and then worked on improving the shelter. He made a roof from the pod's panels. Secured with branches, the girl surprised him by picking up a few sticks and quietly adding them to the structure. She didn't speak, but she worked alongside him without being asked. When they were done, Rian stepped back to look at the small shelter. It wasn't much, but it would keep them dry and hidden. He glanced at her, noticing the faint trace of pride in her eyes as she looked at their work. She caught him looking and quickly turned away. Later, they went to the river together. He filled water packs while she crouched by the edge, watching tiny fish swim past. For the first time, her expression softened. She even dipped her hand in the water and let the current run through her fingers. It was a moment of quiet that felt fragile but real. As the sun set that evening, they sat near the fire again. This time, she was a little closer than before. The shadows of the flames danced on her face and in her eyes. The fear was still there, but it was weaker now. Something new was beginning to take its place. Rian didn't try to push it. Trust wasn't built in a single day. But as the stars appeared overhead, he knew they had taken their first true step toward it. The day began quietly. The forest air was fresh, and the river's soft flow filled the morning with calm. Rian was repairing one of the pod's panels, hoping to turn it into a better shield for the shelter. The girl sat nearby, sharpening a thin stick with a small rock. She didn't speak, but he noticed that she no longer turned away every time his eyes met hers. Clouds drifted across the sky as the hours passed. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up. The tall trees swayed and whispered above them. Rian felt the air shift thicker, heavier, carrying the scent of rain. He looked up, watching as the light dimmed. A storm was coming. He worked faster, tightening the shelter's roof. "We're going to get rain tonight," he said aloud. She glanced up at the sky but didn't answer. Still, she moved to gather more sticks for the fire. It was small things like this that made him notice she was slowly starting to work with him instead of just watching. By nightfall, the wind had become a roar through the forest. The first drops of rain fell, splashing against the metal panels of the shelter. Rian added more wood to the fire, its orange glow flickering across the walls. The girl stayed close to the flames, her knees tucked under her chin. Then the storm truly began. The rain hammered the roof, lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled. so loud it seemed to shake the ground. The girl flinched at every strike of light. Her small hands clutched her legs tighter. Her eyes were wide, darting to every sound outside. A sudden crash shook the Sheltora tree branch. Heavy and wet, slammed down on one side. The roof sagged, threatening to collapse. Rian leaped forward. Holding the panel up with his shoulder, the girl gasped, watching as rainwater poured through. "The gap, stay back," Rian called over the storm. He pushed the heavy branch aside, but not without cost. A sharp edge of metal cut into his shoulder. The pain was instant, but he ignored it, securing the roof again before stepping back. His armor was wet, his skin stung from the wound, but the shelter was safe. When he turned, she was staring at him. Not in fear this time, but in shock. Her gaze dropped to the blood seeping through his sleeve. "You're hurt," she said softly. It was the first time she had spoken more than a single word to him. "It's nothing," Rian replied, sitting down near the fire. He pressed a cloth to his shoulder. She hesitated, then slowly moved closer. Her small hands trembled as she reached out, almost touching the cut before pulling back. "Why?" she began, but didn't finish. "Why did I protect you?" he asked. She gave the faintest nod. He looked into the fire for a moment before answering. Because no one should have to face danger alone. His tone was calm, but every word was true. Something shifted in her eyes then. The wall she had kept between them cracked. Just a little. She looked at him differently, less like an enemy, more like someone she could understand. The storm raged for hours. The wind howled, and the rain seemed endless. Rian kept the fire alive, feeding it until the flames glowed bright and warm. She stayed beside him, closer than before, her shoulders no longer pressed against the far wall. At one point, a loud burst of thunder made the whole shelter shudder. She gasped and instinctively reached for him. Her hand touched his arm, light and quick. But she didn't pull away immediately. Rian didn't move either, letting her know it was fine. When the storm finally began to fade, the fire burned low, casting soft light across their faces. The air was damp and cool. The forest outside was still dripping from the rain. She sat quietly for a long time, then spoke again. "Rian," she said. Testing his name for the first time, he glanced at her, surprised. She was looking down at her hands, but there was a softness in her voice he hadn't heard before. It wasn't trust yet, but it was something close, a bridge beginning to form. "You should sleep," he told her, but she shook her head, staying awake beside him until the fire burned to glowing embers. Somewhere in those silent hours, the fear in her eyes faded just a little more. When dawn broke, the storm was gone. The air smelled fresh, and the sun broke through the clouds. Rian stepped outside to check the surroundings. The girl followed without being asked. She stayed only a few steps behind, but this time it didn't feel like distance, it felt like she was choosing to be there. The wall between them had been there since the first moment they met. But last night, under the roar of thunder and the warmth of the fire, part of it had finally broken. And for the first time, Rian believed that someday it might be gone completely. The forest had changed since the night of the storm. The air felt lighter and the sounds of life returned. Birds sang from the treetops and sunlight streamed through the leaves in soft golden beams. Rian woke early, stepping out of the shelter to stretch. When he turned, he saw the girl already awake, crouched near the fire pit, trying to arrange small sticks the way he did. He watched her for a moment, not wanting to interrupt. Her movements were clumsy, but her focus was serious. When the fire caught, a small flicker of pride crossed her face. It was the first time she had started it without his help. Rian gave a small smile. "Nice work," he said. She didn't respond with words, but she didn't look away this time either. Breakfast was simple grilled fish and a few fruits gathered from the forest. They ate quietly, but it no longer felt like silence between strangers. It was a silence that held comfort, a silence where neither of them needed to explain why they were there. After eating, Rian decided to explore deeper into the forest for supplies. The girl followed without being asked. At first, she walked a few steps behind, but as the hours passed, she began walking beside him. Occasionally, she would point out safe paths through the thick undergrowth. Her knowledge of plants and animal tracks surprised him. They found a patch of berry bushes. Rian picked a few and tasted them. "Safe," he said. Handing some to her, she ate without hesitation, and for the first time, she smiled small, but real. It didn't last long, but it was enough to stay in his mind the rest of the day. By midday, they reached a small clearing where a fallen tree had created a natural bridge over a stream. Rian tested it before crossing. The girl followed, her steps careful. On the other side, a sudden movement in the bushes made her freeze. Rian raised his weapon, ready for trouble. A wild creature burst out, a long, low animal with sharp teeth and glowing eyes. It snarled and leaped toward them. Rian pushed the girl back and stepped in front. Firing a quick burst, the creature yelped and darted away into the shadows. The girl clutched his arm tightly, her breathing fast. For the first time, her fear wasn't of him, it was for him. "You're all right," Rian said, checking her for injuries. She nodded quickly, still holding on to him longer than she realized. They decided to head back to the shelter. Before more creatures came, the walk was quieter now, but different. The distance between them was gone. She stayed close, sometimes brushing his arm when the path narrowed. And she didn't pull away. Back at camp, she surprised him by helping prepare the fish without being asked. She mimicked the way he cleaned them, even laughing softly when her hand slipped and water splashed onto her face. Rian handed her a cloth, and this time she accepted it without hesitation. That evening, as the fire burned low, she sat beside him instead of across from him. The glow of the flames reflected in her eyes, and she seemed deep in thought. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet. "Why do you keep protecting me?" Rian thought for a moment before answering. "Because I can," he said simply. "Because it's the right thing to do." She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then she nodded slightly. The night was peaceful, until a rustling sound came from the forest edge. Both of them turned, eyes searching the darkness. Several smaller creatures crept into the clearing, drawn by the smell of the fish. Rian stood, ready to scare them off, but before he could move, the girl picked up a burning stick from the fire and waved it. The creatures hissed and scattered back into the shadows. When she returned to the fire, Rian gave her an approving nod. "Good thinking," he said. Her eyes lit up just a little at the praise. She didn't smile this time, but he could tell she felt it. Later, when they lay down to sleep, she didn't retreat to the farthest corner of the shelter. Instead, she stayed near him, close enough that he could hear her soft breathing. The forest outside was dark and silent, but inside the small shelter, there was a sense of safety. The bond between them had grown not from words, but from actions, from shared meals, shared danger, and quiet moments that spoke louder than anything they could say. Rian didn't know what the next day would bring. But he knew one thing for certain. The girl no longer saw him as the monster she had feared. She was beginning to see him as something else entirely. The forest night was colder than usual. A sharp wind slipped through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of leaves rustling. Rian added more wood to the fire, but he could feel the temperature dropping fast. Above them, the moon was pale and high, its light spilling softly into the clearing. The girl sat near the flames, her small hands tucked under her arms. Even with the fire, she was shivering. Her thin clothes had been torn long before they met, and the damp air from the earlier rain made them offer little warmth. Rian noticed the way her teeth began to chatter. "You're cold," he said. She nodded without looking up. He reached for one of the blankets they had salvaged from the escape pod. Draping it over her shoulders, he crouched beside her, but he could tell by her trembling that it wouldn't be enough. He glanced toward the shelter. "It'll be warmer inside," he said gently. She hesitated, her eyes shifting between the fire and him. Trust was still fragile. He didn't want to push her, but he also didn't want her to suffer through the cold. Inside the shelter, he sat down against the wall, spreading the blanket over his lap. "Come here," he said quietly. She froze, eyes narrowing. But the wind outside howled, sending another shiver through her, slowly, reluctantly. She stepped closer. Rian shifted the blanket to make space. She hesitated one last time, then lowered herself beside him. Her body was tense at first, every movement careful. He stayed still, letting her settle at her own pace. After a moment, she leaned slightly against him, her head barely touching his shoulder. The warmth between them began to grow. His armor was cold on the outside, but beneath it, his body heat spread quickly through the blanket. She pulled her knees up, curling closer without thinking. He could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing start to slow outside. The forest whispered with the sound of wind and distant creatures. Inside, there was only the soft crackle of the fire and the quiet shift of fabric as she adjusted her position. Her head slid down until it rested fully against his chest. He didn't move, knowing that any sudden gesture might break the moment. Minutes passed in silence. Then, in the faintest voice, she spoke. "Why don't you leave me?" The question was so quiet, it almost disappeared in the sound of the wind. Rian looked down, though she kept her eyes closed. "Because you matter," he said simply. She didn't reply right away, but her hand slowly gripped the edge of his blanket, holding it tighter, as if to anchor herself there, as if she was afraid he might still vanish like everyone else in her life had. Rian rested his chin lightly on the top of her head. He didn't speak further, letting his presence be the answer she needed. Her breathing slowed even more, the tension in her body melting away bit by bit, for the first time since they had met. She truly slept, no restless shifting, no sudden jerks awake, just deep, steady sleep. Her face relaxed, the lines of fear softening in the glow of the firelight. She looked younger, almost peaceful. He stayed awake a while longer. Listening to the sounds of the forest, his eyes moved often to the door, watching for any sign of danger. But a part of him kept returning to the quiet weight of her head against his chest. There was something fragile about this moment, something he knew he needed to protect later in the night. A soft noise outside caught his attention, a branch snapping under something's weight. His hand moved instinctively to his weapon, but before he stood, the girl stirred slightly. Murmuring something in her own language, her fingers gripped the fabric of his sleeve. He glanced down, realizing she wasn't fully awake. She was holding on to him, even in her dreams. He stayed where he was, letting the noise outside fade into the distance. Whatever had been out there was gone now. Hours passed, and the first light of dawn crept into the shelter. The fire was little more than glowing embers. Rian shifted carefully, not wanting to wake her too soon. But her eyes opened slowly, blinking at the dim light. She looked up at him for a moment, and something was different. Her gaze no longer carried the constant edge of fear. There was still caution, but it was mixed now with something warmer. "Did you sleep?" she asked softly. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Not much," he admitted. "You needed it more." She lowered her eyes, but a faint expression, something between gratitude and disbelief, crossed her face that morning. She didn't move far from him, whether they were fetching water or checking the shelter. She stayed within arm's reach. It wasn't just safety she seemed to want now, with closeness. And for Rian, that meant more than he could put into words. That night had been the turning point, the moment when the last wall between them had begun to fall, and though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew she no longer just tolerated his presence. She sought it. She had found her first real place of safety, and it was on his chest. Asterisk, the days after that night were different. The girl no longer kept her distance. She walked beside Rian instead of behind him. She helped gather food. She carried small bundles of sticks. And sometimes, she even spoke first. Each word she gave him felt like a step forward. The forest had become their home for now, but Rian knew they couldn't stay here forever. Supplies from the escape pod were running low, and though they could hunt and gather, the girl needed more than survival. She needed safety among people who wouldn't harm her. One clear morning, as they returned from the river, a low hum filled the air. Rian stopped, tilting his head to listen. The girl froze beside him, her eyes narrowing. It wasn't the sound of a storm, nor the call of any animal. It was mechanical, familiar to him. He climbed a small rise to see above the treetops. And there it was, a small human shuttle, gliding low over the forest. His heart kicked into a faster rhythm. This was the signal he had been waiting for. Rescue had come. The girl's reaction was different. She stepped back, her shoulders tense. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "Friends," Rian said. "People who can help us." But he could see the conflict in her eyes. For her, strangers had never meant safety. They packed quickly, taking only what they could carry. The sound of the shuttle grew louder as it descended into the clearing. Wind from its engines swept through the trees. Bending the branches, Rian stood firm, holding his hand out to her. After a long moment, she took it. The shuttle's ramp lowered, and a pair of human medics stepped out. Their eyes widened slightly when they saw the small alien girl holding tightly to Rian's side. One of them spoke, "We'll take her to the medical bay," and stepped forward. But the girl instantly pressed closer to Rian, her grip tightening. On his arm, her voice shook. "No," she said. The medic paused. Glancing at Rian for guidance, he knelt to meet her eyes. "It's all right," he said softly. "They won't hurt you." But she shook her head again. He realized then that leaving his side felt, to her, like losing safety all over again. So he made the choice without hesitation. "We go together," he told the medics. They nodded. Understanding the tone in his voice inside the shuttle, the girl stayed right beside him. Even when a medic tried to check her injuries, she allowed the examination only when Rian kept one hand resting on her shoulder. The ride was smooth, but she never let go of him. Not even for a second. When they reached the human outpost, a crowd gathered to see the survivors. Some looked surprised, others curious. A commander stepped forward. "Good work, soldier," he said to Rian. "She's in safe hands now." But Rian didn't move away, and the girl didn't loosen her hold. "Safe hands," Rian repeated, glancing down at her. "She already has those." The commander studied them for a moment, then gave a short nod. Rian guided her inside the base. Showing her the bright halls and warm rooms, she watched everything closely, her steps cautious. But she never let the distance between them grow. Days passed in the outpost, and slowly, she began to explore more on her own. But every evening she returned to where Rian was, and every night, when the noise of the base quieted, she would curl up beside him, resting her head against his chest, the way she had that first night of trust. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset through the wide window, she spoke softly. "When I first saw you, I thought you would hurt me." Her voice carried no anger now. It's quiet honesty. Rian didn't interrupt. "But you didn't," she continued. "You stayed, and you kept me safe." He looked at her, seeing the strength in her now. She was still small, still cautious, but the fear that had once ruled her was no longer in her eyes. "I told you," he said gently. "You matter." Outside, the last light of the sun faded, and the stars began to appear one by one. Somewhere beyond them lay the burned prison ship, the cold corridors where they had first met, but that place was behind them now. She leaned against him, closing her eyes. "I can sleep now," she murmured. "Because you're here." Rian didn't answer. He simply wrapped the blanket around both of them, letting her settle against him as the night deepened. In a galaxy where trust was rare and safety even rarer, they had found both in each other. She had once been terrified of him, certain he was her enemy. Now she slept on his chest, knowing it was the safest place in the universe.